Beneath the swastikas and speeches, behind the tanks and terror, the Nazi regime harbored something even stranger. Beliefs so bizarre they make sci-fi look sane. Ice-based cosmology, magic runes, ancestral memories, holy wars against witches. This wasn't just politics. It was myth in uniform. And the most unsettling part? Some of them actually meant it. Welcome to the cold, ritualistic heart of a regime obsessed with symbols, spirits, and stories it made up as it went. These are the 25 weirdest things the Nazis believed. And no, you were not supposed to know any of this. Before we descend any deeper into this labyrinth of lost civilizations and cosmic ice theories, hit subscribe if you love mysteries that leave more questions than answers. This channel's where history gets weird, and stays that way. Also, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight? 3 a.m.? Just curious how far down the rabbit hole we've caught you. 1. World Ice Theory, as a German alternative to Jewish physics. Here's a sentence you never expected to hear. In the Third Reich, ice was not just a substance. It was a cosmic force, a metaphysical blueprint, a cold crystalline answer to Einstein. Enter Welteislehre, or World Ice Theory. A glacial fever dream cooked up by Austrian engineer Hans Horbiger in the early 20th century, this theory claimed the entire cosmos was governed by giant blocks of ice hurtling through space, colliding with moons, planets, and maybe, just maybe, our understanding of physics. Why did this deeply bizarre idea find a warm welcome in Nazi intellectual circles? Simple. It wasn't Jewish. That's it. It was Aryan science. While Einstein's relativity was dismissed as degenerate Jewish physics, world ice theory gained traction in the ideological petri dish of Nazi pseudoscience. It was irrational, unsupported, and incompatible with actual physics, which made it perfect. It wasn't supposed to explain the universe. It was supposed to symbolically reject it. Under Himmler's eye, SS-adjacent institutions gave the theory a kind of mystical endorsement. Not because it worked, but because it didn't, and that made it pure. It flattered Nazi identity by imagining a uniquely German cosmology, one with ice comets and moon collisions, and a cosmic Cold War that never happened, which raises a simple, terrifying question. What happens when you build a regime on spite instead of truth? Apparently, you get Atlantis. 2. Atlantis. A lost Nordic super-civilization as historical proof of Aryan greatness. Atlantis. But make it blonde. To some in the Nazi inner sanctum, especially the early thinkers inside the SS-linked Ahnenerbe, Atlantis wasn't just a myth. It was a memory. A submerged whisper of a primeval Nordic master civilization erased by catastrophe, remembered only in fragments, and, somehow, conveniently Aryan. The story goes like this. Long before the pyramids, before Rome, before history, there existed a hyper-advanced Nordic people who spread culture, order, and racial superiority across the globe. Then, disaster struck. The islands sank, or the poles flipped, or the ice comets came, depending on which theory you preferred, and civilization scattered. But their descendants? Oh, they survived. They became modern Germans, naturally. This myth gave Nazi ideologues the historical equivalent of a cheat code, a fictional past powerful enough to validate real-world conquest. Why prove racial superiority when you can invent it? Why justify colonization when your ancestors supposedly built half the world? Professional archaeologists inside Germany pushed back, some even at personal risk. But the story proved resilient. Atlantis had everything: tragedy, racial fantasy, and zero surviving evidence, which, ironically, made it bulletproof. You can't disprove what never existed. But if Atlantis was the cradle, where was it located? The answer, according to Nazi mythographers, lay somewhere even colder, even weirder, and even more imaginary: the Arctic. If your brain's already reeling from ice comets and sunken Aryan super islands, just know, we're only getting started. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't yet. This channel is your late-night passport to the strangest corners of history. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? I have a theory that these stories hit different after midnight. 3. An Arctic homeland. Hyperborea, Thule-style origins for the Aryans. Picture this, a radiant polar land bathed in eternal twilight, home to the original Aryans, a mythic realm called Thule, or sometimes Hyperborea. To Nazi racial mystics, this wasn't fantasy, it was ancestry. According to SS-aligned theorists and Volkish philosophers, the true origin of the Aryan race wasn't in some Middle Eastern cradle of civilization or African Rift Valley, but in the frozen north, a superior race forged in the ice, radiating downward into the warmer, lazier parts of the world. That alone should give you a sense of the logic at play. The Arctic myth solved a lot of ideological problems. First, it made the Aryans the oldest race, which was politically useful. Second, it explained why Northern Europeans had pale skin, because they had evolved in eternal snowlight. And third, it gave Germany a birthright that no one could challenge, because it existed in an unreachable geography and, perhaps more importantly, in the mind. There was no expedition that ever found Hyperborea, no ancient ruins recovered from under Arctic snow, but none of that mattered. The belief itself was the point. Myth was more powerful than fact, especially when backed by armed men in ruined uniforms. Speaking of which, the next myth wasn't a place, it was an institution. One with oaths, rites, sacred halls, and a leader who thought he was running a medieval cult, the SS. 4. The SS as a revived knightly order with sacred mission centers. The Schutzstaffel, or SS, was not, in Himmler's eyes, just a paramilitary force. It was a knightly order, a holy brotherhood, a racial monastic elite with a mission bigger than politics, bigger than war, and possibly bigger than reality itself. From the outside, the SS looked like an efficient instrument of terror. But on the inside, within its core leadership, Himmler was building a ritual state within a state. Modeled loosely after the Teutonic Knights and other medieval chivalric orders, he imagined the SS as guardians of a reborn Germanic religion, complete with sacred spaces, initiatory rites, and spiritual discipline. This wasn't a metaphor. This was the plan. New SS recruits swore blood oaths not just to Hitler, but to the honor and blood of their kind. Their roles were framed not in terms of power, but of duty, purity, and sacrifice, terms usually reserved for priests or martyrs. And Himmler's ultimate fantasy? A Europe run not by bureaucrats, but by SS governors trained like priest kings, rooted in bloodline, ritual, and myth. The result was something terrifyingly bureaucratic, yet mystically absurd. Men with clipboards who thought they were Grail knights. And speaking of Grail fantasies, what if I told you Himmler had a castle too? 5. Himmler's fixation on Heinrich the Fowler and reincarnation rumors. Every knight needs a patron saint. And for Heinrich Himmler, that was, rather poetically, Heinrich I, known as Heinrich the Fowler, the 10th century king who defended Germany from the east. Himmler's obsession wasn't casual. He visited Heinrich's supposed tomb, modeled SS ideology on his imagined legacy, and according to persistent rumors and post-war accounts, even believed himself to be the spiritual reincarnation of the man. Whether he truly believed that or simply leaned into the myth for theatrical effect is up for debate. But either way, it tells you something crucial. This wasn't politics. This was cosplay with consequences. In Himmler's worldview, Heinrich I represented the perfect fusion of martial strength and spiritual destiny, a king who repelled Slavic tribes and unified the German lands. So of course Himmler saw himself as the heir, or at least, he needed others to see him that way, because building a myth state required more than uniforms. It required legendary continuity. So he framed the SS not as a new invention, but as the rebirth of a sacred order, one with deep ancestral memory, secret rites, and holy places. And that brings us to Wewelsburg, a castle rebuilt brick by brick into a temple of myth. 6. Wewelsburg as an SS mythic hub. Grail, Arthurian room naming and ritual aura. At the bend of a quiet German valley, surrounded by forests and fog, sits a castle shaped like a triangle. Wewelsburg. It could have been a tourist stop. Instead, it became the ideological altar of Himmler's private religion. He didn't just want a headquarters. He wanted a sacred site, a temple of Aryan mysticism. So Wewelsburg was redesigned, not for defense but for ritual. Its rooms were given mythic names: King Arthur, Grail, runes, Nordic heroes. Its central chamber featured a 12-spoked sun wheel, later mythologized as the Black Sun. Its architecture was meant to awaken ancestral memory, even if the memory had to be fabricated wholesale. Inside this eerie fortress, Himmler planned ceremonies, initiations, and gatherings of his top SS men, his version of the Round Table. The castle would be their spiritual anchor, a place for indoctrination, meditation, and myth-making. The war? That was just logistics. This was the soul of the operation. What makes Wewelsburg so disturbing isn't how strange it was. It's how seriously it was taken. This wasn't a hobby. It was a cornerstone of ideology, carved in stone and funded by a regime. And when your ritual state needs a creation myth, you go looking for ancient enemies, preferably witches. 7. Witch research, to prove the church exterminated Aryan womanhood. In most regimes, you don't get government-sponsored witchcraft research. But in Himmler's SS, you got the Hexenkartothek, a vast, obsessive archive of witch trial records meant to prove a very specific conspiracy theory, that the medieval church had conducted a genocidal campaign against Aryan women. The idea? That the witch hunts weren't driven by superstition, misogyny, or religious panic, but by a calculated Catholic plot to destroy Germanic heritage, especially its women, keepers of pagan wisdom, folk healing, and ancestral strength. In this upside-down narrative, the Inquisition became a kind of ideological crime scene, and the witches were not villains, but racial martyrs. SS researchers combed archives, translated court documents, and compiled names, dates, and accusations, not for historical clarity, but to build a myth. One where the Catholic Church was the eternal enemy, and the Germanic people, especially its women, were the suppressed spiritual core of Europe. The Witch Project fit neatly into Himmler's larger war on Christianity, reframed as a foreign force erasing native truths. It also helped mythologize women as both victims and symbols of lost racial purity, useful for a regime obsessed with both. And in the SS's visual language, that meant symbols, especially runes. 8. Runes, as more than decoration, pseudo-runic power language of the SS. To the average observer, SS runes were just intimidating logos, stylized lightning bolts, strange angular shapes, cryptic letters on daggers, flags, and lapels. But to Himmler's inner circle, these weren't just designs, they were charged symbols, fragments of a lost power language that connected the SS to ancient destiny. Inspired by 19th and early 20th century Völkisch rune mysticism, especially the ideas of occultists like Guido von List, the SS adopted runes as more than branding. Each rune supposedly encoded a specific virtue: honor, strength, loyalty, heritage. By using them, the SS wasn't just dressing up, they were invoking. The double sig rune, SS, stood for victory, but also for a mystical invocation of force. The Odal rune on SS settler flags symbolized ancestral land. Runes were placed on gravestones, banners, even marriage certificates. In this worldview, a symbol could bind a person to an ideology, not through belief, but through sacred pattern. This was design as doctrine, myth as graphic language. And in their sacred headquarters at Wewelsburg, these symbols weren't just etched into walls, they were consecrated. One such symbol still sparks debate to this day. It's circular, sun-like, and hidden in plain sight. 9. The Black Sun. Sunwheel mystique. Symbol with debated meaning. In the marble floor of Wewelsburg's central chamber lies a dark 12-spoked sunwheel, commonly referred to as the Black Sun. It looks ancient, but like so many Nazi inventions, it's new mythology dressed in old stone. Nobody knows exactly what the Black Sun meant to the SS. There are no surviving documents that define it clearly. Some interpret it as a solar cult symbol. Others link it to the sun wheels of Indo-European antiquity. Some see it as an esoteric calendar. Others as a symbol of cyclical destiny or racial rebirth. What's certain is that it was meant to be felt, not understood. The ambiguity is the point. In myth-making, the less defined the symbol, the more meaning people can project onto it. The Black Sun became a ritual mirror, reflecting back whatever occult grandeur the viewer brought with them. It's since been adopted by post-war extremist groups who treat it as a mystical swastika, but in its original Nazi setting, it was both mystique and blank slate. This is what the SS excelled at, inventing the past to sanctify the present. And at the center of this symbolic storm was one man who claimed he could remember everything, including the ancient world he said he was born into. 10. Ancestral memory, and invented prehistoric Germanism via SS occult advisor Karl Maria Willigut. Karl Maria Willigut was a man with a beard, a uniform, and an alleged psychic hotline to the prehistoric German soul. By the time he entered Heinrich Himmler's orbit, Willigut was already known in fringe occult circles as a mystic, rune revivalist, and self-declared heir to an unbroken line of ancient Germanic sages. Himmler hired him anyway, and made him chief spiritual advisor to the SS. Willigut didn't just believe in ancestral memory. He claimed to possess it, inherited through his bloodline. According to him, he could access visions of ancient Germanic history stretching back over 200,000 years. Civilizations long erased from any archaeological record, because of course they never existed, unfolded in his revelations. He preached a proto-religion called Germanism, complete with gods, wars, and metaphysical hierarchies, all conjured from the fog of imagination and willpower. Under Himmler, Willigut was given rank, resources, and ritual influence. He designed insignia, renamed rooms in Wewelsburg, and influenced SS ceremonies. The fact that he had previously spent time in a psychiatric institution was either ignored, forgotten, or more likely, considered irrelevant. In a regime allergic to reality, Willigut's fantasies didn't disqualify him. They were an asset, and his beliefs weren't even the strangest in circulation. Because before Willigut, there was Ariosophy. 11. Ariosophy, Aryan wisdom as a cult racial doctrine, pre-Nazi roots, Nazi overlap. Before the swastika became a flag, it was a talisman. And before the SS wore runes, they were borrowed from an earlier esoteric movement known as Ariosophy, a blend of Aryan racial mythology and theosophical mysticism that flourished in fin de siècle Austria and Germany. Ariosophy wasn't one doctrine but a vibe, racial destiny dressed up as spiritual truth. Its prophets, figures like Guido von List and Lanz von Liebenfels, preached that the Aryan race was not just superior in biology, but divine in essence. They believed in ancient Aryan priest kings, cosmic racial wars, rune magic, and secret spiritual hierarchies, all passed down through blood and hidden codes. Although Ariosophy predated the Nazi Party, its themes bled directly into Nazi symbolism. The SS adopted runes from these systems. Himmler's fascination with ancient wisdom echoed Ariosophic visions of ancestral power. Even the idea of a mystical Aryan homeland, Hyperborea, Thule, originated here. But make no mistake, most Nazi leaders weren't card-carrying Ariosophists. These ideas hovered at the edges of ideology, not its center. Yet they were useful, especially when trying to spiritualize racism. And if you're trying to fuse religion with politics, you'd better start with the dominant one, Christianity, or rather its rebranding. 12. Positive Christianity as an ideologically engineered, racially filtered Christianity. The Nazi Party didn't outright ban Christianity, they refashioned it, and they gave it a new name, Positive Christianity. A term so vague it could mean almost anything, which was precisely the point. In theory, Positive Christianity was a purified, non-denominational version of the faith, stripped of Jewish roots, universalist ethics, and any doctrines that didn't support blood and soil. It kept the crosses and the churches, but hollowed out the theology. Jesus? Rebranded as an Aryan. The Old Testament? Quietly ignored. The Sermon on the Mount? Reinterpreted as national service. This sanitized religion became a centerpiece of Nazi propaganda, helping them bridge the gap between radical ideology and a largely Christian population. But it was a balancing act. Inside the regime, figures like Alfred Rosenberg wanted to eliminate Christianity altogether, while others saw it as a political tool. The result was schizophrenic policy: tolerate public piety, undermine real churches, and inject ideology where doctrine used to be. The irony? A regime obsessed with purity couldn't decide what it believed. It just knew what it wanted to control. And for some, the ultimate goal wasn't reformation. It was restoration of something far older than Christianity and far more German. 13. Himmler's vision of restoring old Germanic gods after victory. Heinrich Himmler didn't just want to rewrite history, he wanted to resurrect theology. In private conversations and ideological blueprints, he outlined a future where Germany, after winning the war, would abandon Christianity altogether and return to the worship of pre-Christian Germanic gods. Odin, Thor, Freyr, not as nostalgic folklore, but as state-endorsed divinities in a mythic racial religion. To Himmler, Christianity was a borrowed Semitic faith. It was universalist, forgiving, focused on the individual soul, not the collective bloodline. That wouldn't do for a regime built on hierarchy, purity, and conquest. The old gods, in contrast, offered a tailor-made spiritual model: tribal, violent, masculine, ancestral. Paganism could be molded into a theology of power, where divine right came from blood, not grace. This vision was never rolled out as policy. It was a plan for the post-war world. The churches would be gradually delegitimized. SS education would raise a new generation free of Christian weakness. And eventually the old gods would return, not just as metaphors, but as literal objects of ritual and reverence. The Nazis didn't just want to erase enemies. They wanted to reformat spiritual reality. And that spiritual rewrite included archaeology. Or rather, a very specific, politically convenient interpretation of it. 14. Bog bodies as evidence of ancient anti-homosexual purges, a pseudo-historical moral lesson. In the swampy wetlands of northern Europe, ancient bodies had been discovered, preserved in bogs for centuries. Most historians saw these as ritual sacrifices or executions from Iron Age cultures. But under Nazi ideology, these mute corpses became moral evidence. According to a theory adopted by Himmler and Ahnenerbe-affiliated archaeologists, some bog bodies were said to represent the ritual killing of homosexuals by ancient Germanic tribes. No serious archaeological consensus supported this claim, but that didn't matter. The interpretation was weaponized. For the SS, this idea served a dual purpose. First, it provided a supposed ancestral precedent for modern persecution, framing brutality as restorative justice rooted in tribal law. Second, it portrayed ancient Germans as instinctively clean, strong, and morally pure, a civilization that knew how to deal with degeneracy. This wasn't science. It was moral theater, projected backward in time to justify the present. Real history was replaced with myth, then enforced with policy. The dead were made to speak, and they said what the regime wanted them to say. And if interpreting bog bodies wasn't absurd enough, the regime also tried to find answers in pendulums. 15. Radiesthesia, pendulum dowsing, and border science as usable statecraft. If it sounds like something from a seance, that's because it basically is. Radiesthesia, or pendulum dowsing, was one of several fringe border sciences that found unlikely sponsors within the Nazi state, especially under SS and military experimentation programs. The idea? That with the right concentration, you could locate water, minerals, even enemy submarines using nothing more than a swinging object and intuitive resonance. Ridiculous? Yes, but not too ridiculous for a regime that prized alternative knowledge as long as it claimed to be Germanic, intuitive, or anti-materialist. Himmler in particular had a soft spot for fringe science, and the SS's research arm, the Ahnenerbe, kept the door open for unorthodox experiments. Dowsers were even employed in practical roles during the war, searching for underground installations, water sources, and occasionally enemy secrets. Radiesthesia became part of a broader toolkit of pragmatic occultism, where even discredited or irrational ideas were considered if they might produce results. Rationality wasn't the point. Usefulness was. And if your worldview already believes in ancestral memory and ice-based cosmology, swinging a pendulum starts to seem downright normal. But the pendulum wasn't the only thing spinning, so was the Nazi stance on astrology. 16. Astrology and occult knowledge, both exploited and repressed, depending on politics. If you're looking for consistency in Nazi policy toward the occult, good luck. The regime's approach to astrology and supernatural belief was a chaotic mix of crackdowns, curiosity, and quiet exploitation. In public, Nazi officials condemned astrologers and fortune-tellers as frauds and subversives. In private, they hired them. The contradiction became clearest after Rudolf Hess, a man deeply involved in esoteric thought, flew solo to Scotland in 1941, attempting a rogue peace mission. The regime panicked. Suddenly, astrology and its practitioners were treated as potential threats, accused of spreading destabilizing ideas or influencing powerful minds. Himmler and others began to walk a tighter line. Allow what served the mission, suppress what didn't. But behind the scenes, certain border sciences continued. Astrologers were consulted discreetly. Horoscopes were drawn up for political figures. Some military officers believed planetary alignments could impact battle outcomes. It was the perfect metaphor for the regime's inner logic. Deeply irrational, but dressed in strategic calculation. Occultism was neither fully embraced nor fully banished. It was tolerated when convenient, purged when politically necessary, and always subject to ideological filtering. Still, if you really wanted a portal into Nazi mystical geography, you had to look east. Far east, as in Tibet. 17. Tibet, Shambhala. Fascination as a fantasy geography for Aryan origins and hidden wisdom. In 1938, a group of SS-led researchers packed their gear and set off for Tibet. The official purpose? Zoological and ethnographic study. The actual mission? A surreal expedition into Nazi mythology, searching for signs that Tibet might once have been home to ancient Aryans, or perhaps even the lost knowledge of Shambhala. This wasn't satire, it was state-funded fantasy. To certain ideologues in Himmler's circle, Central Asia was a mystical crossroads, a place where hidden wisdom, ancestral migration routes, and the spiritual blueprint of the Aryan race might all converge. The idea had roots in theosophy, where Tibet was often cast as a land of hidden masters and cosmic secrets. The SS expedition measured skulls, studied rituals, and took endless photographs, trying to reverse engineer racial history through ethnography and environment. What they didn't find was evidence, but that didn't stop them. Like many Nazi research projects, the goal wasn't discovery, it was confirmation. The journey itself became proof of a theory. Tibet became a kind of projection screen for Nazi longing, for origin, for superiority, for spiritual legitimacy. But back home, the tools of that racial mythology were more mechanical, like calipers and spreadsheets and face measurements. 18. Measuring bodies to discover race. Pseudo-anthropology as destiny science. To the Nazi state, a person's destiny could be measured, literally. Anthropologists working under SS institutions and racial offices developed complex systems for quantifying race through body metrics. Forehead slope, nose length, cranial capacity. Each was treated as a clue in the search for Aryan purity. This wasn't fringe, this was policy. Entire divisions of the SS, like the RUSHA, Race and Settlement Office, operated with the assumption that biology was destiny and that physical traits could identify one's racial value. Expedition teams traveled to Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and even Tibet, collecting data and taking thousands of photographs, all in pursuit of a racial taxonomy. In reality, the science was a fraud. The categories were invented. The methods were skewed. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the illusion of authority. The tape measure became a sacred instrument, not because it revealed truth, but because it made ideology look objective. It wasn't about understanding people, it was about sorting them. But race wasn't just something in your skull. According to Nazi metaphysics, it was something in your soil. And that's where we go next. 19. Blood and soil. Metaphysics. Land as a mystical biological force. Blood and soil wasn't just a slogan. It was a worldview, a fusion of body and geography, biology and destiny. To Nazi ideologues, particularly agrarian theorists and SS racial planners, the relationship between people and land wasn't merely economic, it was sacred. The idea held that the Germanic people were organically bound to their native soil, and that this connection shaped both their racial character and their historical mission. In this cosmology, land wasn't just territory. It had memory, spirit, and a kind of racial fertility. When Germans worked the land, they weren't farming. They were fulfilling a mystical contract. And when they expanded eastward into Slavic lands, they weren't invading. They were returning, reclaiming what was rightfully theirs by ancestral inheritance, even if they had to invent that inheritance on the spot. This myth gave moral cover to colonization, genocide, and resettlement. It transformed brutal conquest into sacred restoration. Maps became liturgy, soil became scripture, and race was the priesthood that interpreted it all. But to justify these myths, they needed more than slogans. They needed science, or at least something that looked like it. And so, Einstein had to go. 20. German science versus Jewish science. Physics and method as racial categories. In the twisted epistemology of the Third Reich, truth was not determined by observation or logic. It was determined by ethnicity. Science itself was racialized. Entire fields of knowledge, especially theoretical physics, were divided into Jewish science and German science. The former was dismissed as abstract, degenerate, and rootless. The latter was framed as empirical, grounded, and racially pure, regardless of whether it worked. Albert Einstein's theories, particularly relativity, were labeled as corrosive to the German spirit. Instead, ideologues promoted alternative models, like world ice theory and other pseudoscientific constructions that fit ideological needs. What mattered wasn't explanatory power, but worldview compatibility. This wasn't just philosophical, it was institutional. Universities purged Jewish scientists. Research grants were redirected. Journals were censored. And in their place, Nazi-friendly academics elevated ideologically safe but scientifically hollow ideas, as long as they aligned with the myth of Aryan intellectual supremacy. It was the ultimate gaslight, to weaponize science not by falsifying results, but by redefining what science even was. Still, some in the regime didn't stop at reinterpretation. They built entire institutions to manufacture evidence for ancient Aryan superiority. And the most infamous of them was the Ahnenerbe. 21. Ahnenerbe as an evidence factory for myth. Institutionalized pseudo-archaeology. The Ahnenerbe, short for Deutsches Ahnenerbe, or ancestral heritage, was part think tank, part expeditionary force, part propaganda machine. Officially, it was an SS research institute. In practice, it was an ideological forge, tasked with producing the myths that would justify Nazi racial doctrine, territorial claims, and historical revisionism. Founded in 1935 under Himmler's patronage, the Ahnenerbe launched expeditions across Europe and Asia. Its mission, to uncover, or invent, traces of ancient Aryan civilizations that predated and outshone all others. Archaeological digs were conducted with a predetermined goal, to prove that the Germanic race had been the original civilizing force everywhere from Scandinavia to Tibet. Scientific rigor was optional. Spectacle was mandatory. Findings were twisted or fabricated. Artifacts were misattributed. Anything that could be used to support racial myth was elevated, no matter how tenuous. And real historians or archaeologists who disagreed? They were silenced, sidelined, or replaced. The Ahnenerbe didn't just distort science, it institutionalized fantasy. It transformed ideology into a form of empirical theater, complete with maps, relics, and academic footnotes. But some beliefs didn't need digs or artifacts. They just needed a target, and Christianity was always standing in the way. 22. Christianity is Semitic. The SS pushed to de-Christianize elite identity. In public, the Nazi regime performed a delicate dance with Christianity. Churches weren't outlawed, crosses weren't torn down overnight, and prayers still echoed in German cathedrals. But in private, especially within the SS, there was a growing conviction that Christianity was incompatible with Nazism. More than that, it was seen as fundamentally Semitic, a foreign, pacifist, universalist doctrine that undermined the racial and martial worldview the regime sought to impose. Heinrich Himmler, in particular, viewed Christianity as a spiritual obstacle, something that had weakened the Germanic soul for over a millennium. Inside the SS, efforts were made to systematically de-Christianize elite culture. Religious holidays were reinterpreted as seasonal rites. SS marriage ceremonies removed Christian elements entirely. Funeral rites were rewritten. Crosses gave way to sun wheels and runes. The goal, wasn't just rejection, it was replacement. This ideological drift culminated in a vision of a post-Christian Germany led by an SS priesthood grounded in ancestral faith. In this imagined future, Christianity would be phased out quietly, generationally, replaced by something more authentic, a Germanic tribal spirituality engineered from myth. But old faiths weren't enough. The SS also needed a model of conquest, and they found it in the medieval past, complete with swords, crusades, and holy empire. 23. Mythic medievalism. Teutonic Knights as a model for future Eastern Empire. To understand how the SS viewed its mission in Eastern Europe, you need to go back, not decades but centuries, to the medieval crusading orders that once marched eastward with cross and sword. The Teutonic Knights, in particular, became a kind of mirror for SS ideology. Holy warriors of German blood, carving out fortresses in the Slavic frontier, bringing order to what the Nazis would later call chaos. This wasn't casual nostalgia. It was a template. Himmler studied their structures, rituals, and symbolism. He reimagined SS expansion into Eastern Europe as a continuation of the medieval mission, not as colonization, but as spiritual return. Just as the Knights once built castles and converted pagans, so too would the SS establish settlements and civilize the East through force and faith, though not the Christian kind. Wewelsburg itself was designed to reflect this medieval vision. SS leaders were envisioned as new knight commanders. Entire settlement policies, Lebensraum included, were justified using this mythical past. History was rewritten as prophecy. But even this wasn't the root of their worldview. Beneath the rituals and the ruins was something more primal, a belief that evil wasn't political, it was cosmic. 24. Occult roots as a mobilization culture. Supernatural thinking used to demonize enemies. In the cultural imagination of the Nazi regime, enemies weren't just political opponents. They were forces of darkness. The language of propaganda increasingly framed conflict not in terms of diplomacy or ideology, but as a spiritual war, a mythic struggle between cosmic good and evil. And in this worldview, supernatural thinking wasn't a fringe curiosity. It was a mobilization tool. The regime absorbed a wide array of esoteric influences: border science, occult motifs, mystical symbols, and apocalyptic language. These were woven into everything from speeches to children's books. Jews were portrayed not just as political threats, but as metaphysical corruptors. Bolshevism wasn't just a system, it was demonic contagion. German soldiers weren't merely fighters. They were spiritual warriors on a sacred mission. This kind of thinking made total war easier to justify. When the enemy is evil incarnate, anything becomes permissible. Violence is sanctified, compromise is betrayal, and propaganda becomes revelation. This metaphysical framing wasn't uniform or official, but it was everywhere, ambient, always bubbling beneath the surface of policy and culture. Still, not all Nazi myths were real, even to them. Some came later, post-war legends born from conspiracy and pulp fiction. And one of the strangest? It came from beneath our feet. 25. Hollow Earth. Hohlweltlehre. Claims, mostly post-war myth, weak evidence for state belief. No Nazi conspiracy reel is complete without a cameo from the Hollow Earth theory, the idea that the Earth is not a solid sphere, but a kind of cosmic nesting doll, with vast inner chambers, hidden civilizations, or even entrances at the poles. In some versions, the Nazis fled into these subterranean realms after the war. In others, they were already in touch with the inner Earth beings, ancient Aryans, Atlantean survivors, or hyper-advanced subterranean allies. The reality? Much less dramatic. While the Hollow Earth theory did exist in early 20th century Germany, particularly through fringe thinkers like Peter Bender and Karl Neupert, there is little credible evidence that it was ever seriously adopted by Nazi institutions. No Ahnenerbe memos, no SS expeditions to the South Pole, no bunkers with elevators to Agartha. What we do have are post-war exaggerations, Cold War pulp fiction, and later extremist myth-making that retroactively grafted this fantastical belief onto the Nazis to boost its intrigue. It's a strange inversion. Where once the Nazis invented myths to sanctify their power, now myths are invented about the Nazis, as if the real horrors weren't enough. But that's the thing about belief systems built on fantasy. They never stay buried.